Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today I'm going over the news that independent Senate candidate Dan Osborn, who ran for Senate in 2024, is officially launching another run in 2026. So if you're unfamiliar with this, Dan Osborn ran an independent campaign against the Republican incumbent Senator Deb Fischer back in 2024. And that race ended up being a lot closer than expected, and a large part was given that Dan Osborn ran as an independent candidate who said he would not want to caucus with the Republicans or Democrats in the U.S. Senate. And that helped give the Democrats the best chance at winning a seat in Nebraska due to the fact that even though Osborn said he would not align with either party, the Democrats don't have much of a chance at winning in the state of Nebraska, whereas an independent like Osborn, who can appeal to both a lot of Republicans, Democrats, and more centrist independent voters, Osborn has that ability, so the Democrats decided not to run a candidate, and that gave Osborn enough support on the Democratic side with moderates and made this race very close. Now Osborn is back for 2026. This time around, he'll be running against Republican Senator Pete Ricketts, who was also, I believe, the former governor of the state of Nebraska. So a lot can be made about this. When you look at this race, for starters, you have to talk about the last election in 2024 in Nebraska. This race for Deb Fischer versus Dan Osborn ended up being very close. It was a 6.7% win for Fischer over Osborn. That is a likely Republican victory. The Democrats won the overall Senate map by about 1 point nationally, but this race was very close at 6.7%. And mind you, this is the state of Nebraska. On the same ballot, it voted for Donald Trump statewide by about 20.5%, an overwhelmingly safe Republican state. But the Senate race won for Fischer by 6.7%. A very interesting wrinkle in this is Pete Ricketts was also up in a special election, but again, in this scenario, Ricketts ran against a Democratic candidate the Democrats put up. Here, Ricketts won by 25.2%. Now, it is worth noting, as the former governor of the state of Nebraska, who had pretty high approval ratings when he left office, Ricketts likely did better than a generic Democrat would do against him in this race. He did do better, about a few points or so. For instance, he did 5% better than President Trump did in the margin of victory. But we kind of have a few things going on here. President Trump showed what a safe Republican win looks like in Nebraska in 2024. Pete Ricketts showed what an even better safe Republican win could look like for a Senate race in 2024. Whereas Deb Fischer and Dan Osborn showed what the worst case scenario, maybe even worse than this, could be for a Republican versus independent in 2024. So what does this mean for 2026? Well, a few things. For one thing, noting that what's the election environment going to be like in 2026? That's the question that everyone's asking right now. Right now, the generic ballot, this is more for the House than for the Senate, but right now it's currently have Democrats around 2.4%, a 2.4% lead. Now, come November of 2026, I would bet this is probably going to be a larger margin of victory. It's really contingent on how President Trump and the Republicans are doing and how they are viewed by a majority of Americans. Do the American people believe President Trump is doing a good enough job? And if not, how much do they want to support the Democrats as sort of a rebuke of President Trump's job performance? That's going to be the question. But at 2.4%, when the Democrats won by about 1% or so last time around, that would be about a 2.5 point shift or a 2 point shift, or no, I'm sorry, a 1.5 point shift on the Senate map from 2024. So just going off these numbers alone, I'm going to try using the shift feature here. Going to shift this map just by a little bit, just by about 1.5%, just to show you what happens. Not a very large shift in terms of overall numbers, but Pennsylvania, which narrowly voted for the Republicans, does shift towards the Democratic side. Every other Senate race remains about the same. But let's say Democrats do even better. Let's say they shift another 1 point on top of that. Well, at that point, this Nebraska Senate race in 2024 would fall under 5%. Now, obviously, each Senate election cycle is different. It's not always done in a vacuum. So it's going to be different in 2026. Pete Ricketts is a much stronger Republican candidate than Deb Fischer is. It's also worth noting, I don't think Pete Ricketts would get caught sleeping as much as Deb Fischer did in terms of not spending enough time and attention to Dan Osborn and the potential threat he poses in that Senate race. The Senate race right now, Dan Osborn joins this race with about $56,000 cash on hand, but that's likely going to grow. And given that 2026 is supposed to be a more Democratic-friendly midterm environment, I expect there will be a lot of money coming in for Dan Osborn. This time, I wouldn't be shocked if national Democrats did throw money in this race as well to try and help Osborn out. Their current political predictions for this race, Inside Elections and Cook Politico from the rankings back in February, have it listed as solid Republican. Salvador Crystal Ball did update it a few days ago when Osborn entered this race, moving it down to likely Republican. Rachel White House has it as April 8th as likely Republican as well. It all really is dependent on how this election cycle is going to go, because Nebraska, at the beginning and end of it, is a safe Republican state, and Republicans shouldn't have much to worry about. However, it does speak to the fact that Dan Osborn is such a very strong candidate in this race. A large part that he is very strong goes again to that fact that he is an independent candidate. He is not a Democrat. He is someone that can get a lot of Democrats and independents and even some Republicans to vote for him, as he did back in 2024. Again, he only lost his Senate race by about 7 points against a Republican incumbent senator, who, mind you, she is relatively unpopular in a lot of the early polling leading into this race, but Dan Osborn showed an independent candidate has a much better chance at winning Nebraska than a Democratic candidate would do. What's interesting is I did think of this scenario as something that happened kind of similarly back, I believe it was 2014. It might have been the Senate race or it might have been the governor's race. No, it was the Senate race, where Republican incumbent Senator Pat Roberts was very unpopular, and Democrats were hoping to beat him. But Democrats, like in Nebraska, don't have really much of a chance at winning Kansas. Instead, independent candidate Greg Orman decides to run for this race. Democrats, I don't believe, put up a candidate in this race. They do not. So it ends up being Roberts versus Orman. And for a while, the polls looked like they were very, very close. It ended up being about an 11-point win for Roberts over Orman, but that's actually, when you look at things, pretty good. Because the next election for the Republican Moran versus the Democrat ended up being about a 30-point Republican win. But in 2014, it was only about a 10.5-point win for the Republican over the independent. Orman's name would also come up again. I believe he ran for governor, and I want to say it was 2018. This helped Laura Kelly win. Orman got 6.5% of the vote. But it's interesting that these independent candidates, like in Kansas with Greg Orman and now with Dan Osborn in 2024, they have a special ability of getting voters, both Democrats, independents, and a good number of Republicans, to vote for them and support them in these elections against these Republican incumbents. And it shows that there may be an appetite for more of these independent, moderate candidates than the partisan, farther right, farther left candidates in these races. Now, that being said, does this mean that Pete Ricketts is in dangerous trouble of losing in 2026? It's a really difficult question, because my gut instinct for that is no. And the reason being that Nebraska, with Pete Ricketts in 2024, Ricketts won by 25.2%, but it was against a Democrat. Against Osborn, this margin of victory is going to be a lot smaller. The election environment for 2026 should be more favorable for the Democrats than 2024 was, which gives the Democrats the advantage. But Ricketts is also a stronger Republican candidate than Deb Fischer was. He was the former governor of the state, and he's going to take Osborn much more of a serious threat. So the Republicans, both in Nebraska and nationally, may not be caught, may not be caught by surprise as much as Osborn's candidacy if they take him seriously, knowing that Osborn is a very serious and potentially dangerous candidate that could win in the right scenario. Now, with that being said, I think Pete Ricketts is going to be in a stronger position to win due to the fact that Republicans are going to take him seriously, but Republicans will also have to throw potentially some money and resources into defending Pete Ricketts in this race just to make things all sure. And that is very important. Because when you look at the Senate map right now, I took Nebraska off because I want to do a quick ranking of it, but in my most recent prediction video, I have Republicans getting about 51 Senate seats, not counting Nebraska, and Democrats getting about 45, with 3 very important toss-up seats in Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia. New Hampshire and Maine I also have being very competitive. And then 3 additional Senate races in Texas, Iowa, and Ohio, which I currently have as likely Republican. I think they stay in the Republican category, but they certainly are going to be more competitive than some of these other safe states. With Osborn now in this race, I did have Nebraska previously as safe Republican. I no longer have that. I'm not going to start Nebraska off as lean Republican because I do think that is undercutting Pete Ricketts' electability just a little bit. I think right now Ricketts would win in the likely Republican column, which is in between 5 and 15%. If you want to get really specific, despite the Democratic environment, I think he would start off about a 9-point win for Ricketts over Osborn. But this gives the Democrats another potential avenue to trying to get back to 50 Senate seats. Because if Republicans are having to spend money and resources in Nebraska, well, money's not unlimited. Even though the Republicans and President Trump do have a good amount of money right now heading into the midterms, that's going to go away very quickly. And if the Democrats are able to fundraise and get a lot going in 2026 with a lot of anti-Trump sentiment, that could give the Democrats an opportunity where the Democrats could take the top 3 toss-up Senate races right now in Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia, 3 places where Michigan's a Democrat incumbent retiring, North Carolina could have the former Governor Roy Cooper running, that would be a strong Democrat candidate, and Democrat incumbent Jon Ossoff is possibly right now, if the election were held today, I would say he would win this race outright. This would get the Democrats up to 48 seats. Another top target is Susan Collins in Maine. I think Susan Collins is more likely than not going to win a very narrow election in 2026, but let's go down the scenario where maybe she ends up losing. This gets Democrats up to 49, Republicans are at 51. Again, the Republicans only need 50 seats to have the majority because Vice President J.D. Vance breaks all ties. But there's a possibility here where the Democrats could reach 50 and make it a lot more competitive. And that's if Dan Osborn does end up winning this race. Now, he has said he's not going to caucus with the Republicans or the Democrats if he wins. So let's say he doesn't officially caucus with the Democrats, but that would have Republicans at 50, Democrats at 49. That would make the Republicans' job a lot harder because then J.D. Vance would have to come in on every single vote pretty much, and that would make passing President Trump's agenda a lot more difficult. In an even more unlikelier scenario, which again I don't think is going to happen, but what if, for instance, the Democrats, with Ken Paxton as a Republican nominee, find a way to flip Texas blue? I don't think this is going to happen, but let's just say in that scenario it does. Well, then Osborn winning, 50 Democrats, 49 Republicans, Osborn would technically, even though he refuses to caucus with the Republicans or Democrats, would give the Democrats essentially a majority by keeping the Republicans from reaching 50 Senate seats. So this Nebraska Senate race, I don't think it's going to go for Dan Osborn over the Republican Pete Ricketts. I think it's a little bit outside of his ability to win this race, despite him being a very good and impressive candidate. I think the state's a little too Republican friendly for him to do so. But if it were to happen, there could be a real scenario where it looked like a few months ago the Democrats had no chance at getting a majority in the U.S. Senate. If Osborn were to be able to pull off an upset victory, it could conceivably give a path for the Democrats to get a Senate majority. But again, that's all speculation. I'm not predicting that to happen at this time. But the prospect of Osborn winning is something that's very interesting and something Democrats should take a legitimate look at for 2026, even though I do think it does start out in the likely Republican category to start right now. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to leave your thoughts and comments below what you think about Dan Osborn running, and do you think he could win in the Senate race against Pete Ricketts? Leave all your thoughts down below. Also, make sure to hit like and subscribe as well. Thank you so much for watching. Hope to see you in a future video. Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we're going over the important election news that Republican Tudor Dixon, who was the Republican governor nominee for Michigan in 2022, has officially ruled out running for governor or senator in Michigan again in 2026. So there's a lot to get into here. First, I'm going to read the official statement that Tudor Dixon put out on her X Twitter page, where she says that President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance are saving America from securing the border at rapid speed and removing dangerous criminal illegal aliens from our communities. To bringing manufacturing jobs home and lowering taxes, President Trump's America First policies are already having a positive effect for Americans. My focus is protecting and advancing those policies, and as such, I will not be a candidate for the Republican nomination for Michigan governor or U.S. Senate in 2026. I will continue traveling our great state to support Trump policies and the candidates authentically embracing them. President Trump's drive to save our country and be the voice for working people is remarkable. I want to do my part to ensure his America First policies are cornerstones beyond 2028. But first, it's critical that Michigan Republicans win in 2026. Gretchen Whitmer has been a disaster for our state. Jocelyn Benson, a conniving career far-left agitator, will be dangerous and infinitely worse. Michigan voters must fire her, and with the right alternative, they will. I have met with countless Michiganders from Macomb to Menominee to Muskegon over the last 4 years, and we care about saving our state, and I'll be fighting right beside them said Tudor Dixon. So this is pretty important news for 2026, and here's why. Tudor Dixon has been considered a possible candidate for both governor and senator in Michigan for a while now. And you may remember her name because she was the governor nominee, as I mentioned, in 2022 versus Gretchen Whitmer. Now, in that election, it actually didn't go that well for Dixon. Whitmer ended up winning re-election by 10.5%. It is worth noting Gretchen Whitmer had pretty strong approval ratings going into this election, but she ended up winning by about 10.5% in the state of Michigan. That is very, very impressive, regardless if you're a Democrat or Republican, but that's very impressive for Gretchen Whitmer to do. Now, obviously, Dixon losing by 10.5%, as impressive as this for Whitmer, is going to be a negative reflection on Dixon's electoral prospects as well. But Whitmer winning by 10.5% was good for the Democrats, especially when you consider the state of Michigan just in 2024, 2 years later, gave Donald Trump its 16 electoral votes by 1.4% against Kamala Harris. So Michigan in 2026 is expected to be a lot more of a competitive state in both the governor and Senate elections. And Tudor Dixon in the early Republican primary polls showed she started out with a very large floor of support. In the Republican primary, when her name was included in some of these polls, the most recent poll from May showed John James leading at 42% and 44% respectively, but Tudor Dixon started out with around 20 to 24%. So she started with a very high floor in this poll. In a Mitchell Research poll back in March, it was even closer. John James at 31%, Dixon had 30%. So if Dixon decided to run for this race, it's very possible she may have gotten the endorsement of President Trump like she did back in 2022, and that could have given her a primary win. But even without it, she was starting out with a very high floor of support, and that was the governor's race. In the Senate race as well, a very similar situation. The Republican nominee from 2024, Mike Rogers, is running again, and it's been expected he'll probably be the Republican nominee, but Tudor Dixon's name was mentioned as a possible Republican candidate, and when her name was mentioned in this poll, first from the Fabrizio Lean Associates poll from back in February, she started out beating Mike Rogers 40% to 36% in that poll, 4-point lead. In that same Mitchell Research poll, when the governor won, she led 28 to 25% over Rogers. So there seems to be more of a pro-Trump MAGA wing of the Republican Party disgust towards Mike Rogers and more in favor of Tudor Dixon than for John James and the governor's side of things, but it showed Tudor Dixon started out with a very large floor of support. But now that she's ruled that out, Republicans like John James and Mike Rogers don't have to worry about her running in this race. The early polling that's been done that did involve Tudor Dixon, there hasn't been much on the Senate side of things. I don't believe there was only one poll with Whitmer versus Dixon. This would be a rematch, but on the Senate level, and this one showed Whitmer leading by 1 point. There's not really too much to take away from that one because that's the only poll that had Dixon mentioned on that one. There was Dana Nessel versus Tudor Dixon, but she has also not entered the race officially yet, but that did show a tied race, where in some of these early polls, it actually shows Mike Rogers leading over a lot of these Democratic candidates. He has lost to Haley Stevens in the two most recent polls, but in very close margins, where Rogers has defeated the other Democrat, Abdul Sayed, and Mallory McMorrow in these polls. Tudor Dixon has not been polled in these ones, obviously, but she was losing on those ones. On the governor's side of things, in the early hypothetical polling, one poll does involve Tudor Dixon, and this was Jocelyn Benson versus Tudor Dixon versus now independent former Democrat Mike Duggan. And on this poll, it showed that Benson led Dixon by 4 points on this matchup, and then on this part, leading or trailing by 9 points. Mitchell Research, that same poll, showed Dixon leading or trailing by 2 points. So the polling so far seems to show Tudor Dixon actually doing a little bit poorer than the leading Republican candidates, both for governor and senator, despite the fact that she has a very strong floor of support on the Republican side. But with Dixon officially not running, this gives the Republicans a little bit more clarity on their primaries. Governor, it's still probably going to be John James that ends up being the Republican nominee for governor. On the Senate side, even though another Republican is expected to be entering in this race, Bill Huizenga, the U.S. representative, I would still expect Mike Rogers to start out in all likelihood as the likely Republican nominee in this race, and both races that are expected to be very close. As I mentioned, in 2024, President Trump won the state of Michigan by 1.4%. That's certainly going to give Republicans a lot of optimism here. Another very close one was the Senate race on 2024 on that same ballot, where the Democrat Lisa Slotkin defeated Mike Rogers by just 0.34%. However, it does need to be noted here that While Lisa Slotkin was more of a well-known candidate than likely some of the Democrats running now, this was a more favorable election environment for the Republicans than 2026 in all likelihood is going to be. Midterm elections are usually more favorable for the party not in charge of the White House, and the Democrats will be the party seeking to benefit from that. So this time around, Michigan should be more Democratic friendly than it was in 2024 and 2026, but we'll have to wait and see how that all goes. I did mention that governor's race in 2022, where Gretchen Whitmer did win by 10.5% against Tudor Dixon, a likely Democratic win. 2018, Dixon also won by a likely Democratic win of 9.6% against the Republican Schwett. You have to go back to 2014, the last time we saw a Republican win, where then Governor Snyder won by 4.1%. So this will be the first governor's election in Michigan without Gretchen Whitmer at the top of the ticket since 2014. So how this ends up going, we'll wait and see. It's going to be very close. That third-party candidate in Mike Duggan certainly is making things very interesting to watch for as well. My most recent Senate prediction, I did have Michigan as one of the 3 toss-up seats at this time. I do currently have the state going tilt Democrat. Right now, the Democratic primary is wide open. We're going to have to wait and see how that all goes. But I do think Michigan being more Democratic-friendly national environment in 2026 than 2024, if Mike Rogers wasn't able to win with President Trump at the top of the ticket helping him, I have a little bit of a hard time imagining him winning this race without President Trump helping. But I still think it's going to be very close, around a 1-point win or less for the Democrats. On the governor's side of things, very similar here. In this one, I think that Mike Duggan takes a very large third-party vote away. I think it ends up being something like Duggan getting around 20%, and then the Republicans and the Democrats being about a 1-point margin of victory between them, around like 35, 36% or so in that range. But I think this race is going to be very close, but I do think the Democrats are nearly favored to hold on and win by about 1 point at this time. But I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on this news. Make sure to leave a comment below telling me what you think about Tudor Dixon not running in the 2026 elections in Michigan. Also, make sure to hit like and subscribe as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video. Today we're going over the important election news for the state of Pennsylvania in 2026, which is Republican incumbent Congressman Dan Meuser has opted against running for governor in 2026. Now this is very big news, as the Republican congressman did get the endorsement of President Donald Trump earlier this year, saying that if he decides to run for governor, President Trump will give him his complete and total endorsement. However, Dan Meuser has opted against running for governor in 2026 against incumbent Democratic Governor Josh Shapiro. So this is where things get very interesting in this race. Someone like Dan Meuser, who has the endorsement of President Trump already, deciding not to run, speaks about the electoral, I would say, strength or prowess of the current governor, Josh Shapiro. This governor's race, where Shapiro has not officially said he's going to run again, but in all likelihood he will be facing off against a Republican like Meuser in an election that was a very big win for Shapiro back in 2022 against the Republican Doug Mastriano, a 14.8% win. Shapiro really blew out Doug Mastriano in this election. You can see here about a 15-point win here. Obviously, Bucks County being likely Democratic, large margins up here in the central part of Pennsylvania as well. I can get more into that, more in depth on that in just 1 second, but Shapiro really won a blowout election against Mastriano here. And even though in 2024 we saw President Trump win the state of Pennsylvania by 1.7% against Kamala Harris in the presidential race, Trump was able to flip counties very narrowly, like Bucks County, like Northampton, like Monroe, like Lackawanna, got a lot more competitive. It just wasn't like this in that governor's race against Doug Mastriano. So Josh Shapiro, whose approval rating still remained very high in the state of Pennsylvania, you can see why a congressman like Dan Meuser, who would probably lose that election against Shapiro, why would he give up his House seat, the 9th District, to run against Shapiro, what likely would be a losing endeavor. Now, the Republicans do have Stacey Garrity, the Pennsylvania State Treasurer. She has an announcement pending running for this race. Scott Martin and Doug Mastriano are also mentioned as possible candidates, though Mastriano said if Garrity runs, he would run for lieutenant governor. It shows that not a lot of super well-known Republicans in Pennsylvania are wanting to run for this race. Dave Sunday, for instance, the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, who was first elected in 2025, also ruled out a run. And I think it's a lot of Republicans are scared to run against Josh Shapiro, given how electorally strong that he is. It's likely Democrat, according to Cook Politico, Sabo Cristobal, and Race to the White House, battleground, according to Inside elections. But again, Pennsylvania in 2024 voted for Donald Trump for president in a very close election. 2020 very narrowly voted for Joe Biden for president in a very close election. And then 2016 also voted very narrowly for Donald Trump in a very close election. But the governor level, it has not been that way. In 2022, Josh Shapiro, which ended up 2022 was supposed to be a very good Republican midterm, ended up being more of like a 50-50 midterm. The overturning of Roe v. Wade likely played a very large role in that, but ended up being a 50-50 midterm. Josh Shapiro won this race against Mastriano by 14.8%. This is on the same ballot where the Senate race in 2022, John Fetterman defeated Dr. Mehmet Oz, by 4.9%, which was a pretty impressive win for Fetterman, the Democrat, of 4.9%, and not a strong showing for Oz. But still, that was still technically a lean Democratic win. The governor's race was a almost safe Democratic win at 14.8%. And when you look at the election environment for 2026 compared to 2022, 2026 is going to be a stronger night for the Democrats based on historical precedent. Right now, the generic ballot, Democrats have about a 2.4% national lead. But let's say the Democrats, overall, the national environment is about Democrat plus 3, plus 4, plus 5. That would be more favorable than what 2022 was and what 2024 was. Shapiro very well could win re-election by an even larger margin than he got against Mastriano in 2022. Now, the talk about Mastriano being a very weak candidate suggested that any Republican that the Republicans put up in 2026 would likely do better than Mastriano did in 2022. Depending on the election environment, that may actually not even be the case. We'll have to wait and see how that all goes, though. But in 2018, the Democratic governor, Tom Wolf at the time, did win re-election by 17.1%. So it's not like Pennsylvania hasn't re-elected their Democratic governor by a over 15% margin of victory. It just happened in 2018, which was also the last midterm election that had a Democratic-friendly environment due to President Trump's first term in the White House. This was the midterm election for when Trump was president. 2026, if anything, should be more like 2018 than what 2022 was like. So that's how it went in 2018. In 2014, the then Democrat Tom Wolf defeated the Republican Governor Corbett by 9.9%. So that's 3 elections in a row, including the very Republican-friendly midterm year, where the Democrats have won by at least a likely Democratic margin at the governor level. 2010 was the last time it went Republican, where Corbett won by 9 points, though again, 2010 seems like a long time ago, and 2010 was a very good Hall of Fame type night for the Republicans in terms of electoral performance. 2026 is not going to be anything like 2010 for the Republicans. So Meuser's decision in Pennsylvania, it's obviously a very telling sign that he does not want to run against Josh Shapiro, but in the grand scheme of things, it really doesn't change that much. My most recent prediction, I had Shapiro winning in a likely Democratic margin. I did mention, come Election Day 2026, I would not be surprised if I ended up having it by over 15% in a safe Democratic win, and that really remains unchanged. Meuser having the endorsement of President Trump maybe would get some Pennsylvania voters that voted for Trump in 2024 out to vote for him again in 2026 for Meuser, but with him not running, I'm not sure Pennsylvania is going to be any more or less competitive than it already would have been, and that's more of a sign of how electorally strong Shapiro is going to be in 2026 and how that will likely go into a possible 2028 Democratic presidential campaign for Shapiro as well. But again here, just looking at the counties in Pennsylvania, look at the margins that Shapiro was able to get. Bucks County, suburban area, President Trump narrowly won it in 2024. Shapiro won it by 20 points. He won Berks County, 51-47. Lehigh, 59-39. Northampton, 56-42. Monroe, 54-44. Lackawanna, 61-37. Luzerne County was a very narrow win for Shapiro over Mastriano. Look at 2024, what President Trump was able to do. Trump won Bucks County by a very narrow margin. Berks County voted for Trump by 13 points. Lehigh was only a 3-point win for Harris. Northampton was won by Trump. Carbon was won by Trump. Big Monroe was won by President Trump. Pike County went red. Wayne County went red. Lackawanna was only a 3-point win for Harris. Luzerne was a 19-point win for Trump over Harris in 2024. Look what Shapiro was able to do in these key areas. And this map is even more telling. In literally every single county in Pennsylvania, it shifted towards the Democratic side in 2022 with Josh Shapiro leading here, and by pretty large margin in all, if not most of them. So it shows Shapiro did very well, and Doug Mastriano did very, very poorly in 2022. However, could Stacey Garrity or any other Republican candidate do drastically better than Mastriano in 2026? The election environment suggests probably not. Josh Shapiro's approval ratings also suggest probably not. So this is one I'm sure the Republicans would like to have more competitive, and that's why President Trump likely wanted Dan Meuser to run for this race. But him not running, I think, is a telling sign that a lot of Republicans are scared of running against Shapiro in 2026 in this governor's race after what he did to Mastriano in 2022, in an election that's likely going to be a very big re-election victory for Josh Shapiro over whoever the Republicans end up nominating. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below, tell me your thoughts. Also, make sure to hit like and subscribe on the video as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in a future video.